The Threat of Nuclear Winter, the Art Historical Perspective. Today I will explore Jeffrey Rubinoff's insight on the end of the age of agriculture. I begin by quoting this insight, which I think we dealt with a couple of times yesterday, but I think it's important to review it again. The domestication of animals is believed to have begun 13,000 years ago. However, with crop cultivation 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, a large majority of the population was required to be bound to the land. Cultivation leads to the first continuously settled villages and to civilization itself. Security and continuity, rationalized by predictable food production, originated specialized political, civil, religious, and military institutions. Institutionalizing a warrior class was the most dangerous necessity of this social sea change. If the military were not directed outward, it would threaten the stability of the non-military institutions. Thus, a constant state of war became inevitable, and indeed the history of city-states and empires appears to confirm perpetual states of war. The feasibility of escalating war has become absurd with the advent of strategic bombing and nuclear weapons. No military institutions can claim to guarantee security of territory. Moreover, at the end of the age of agriculture, only a minute fraction of the population is required to produce the current surpluses of food, and thus the fundamental assumptions of the age of agriculture, security of territory as a means to secure food production, must be revised to the era of global vulnerability. So the image you see on the screen is by an artist, a pop artist who emerged in the early 1960s. I'll discuss another work of his, but not this one. I think this is just a nice sort of introductory piece for you to look at now. So as Jeff suggests, since the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, humankind has lived with a constant threat of mutually assured destruction, and that this is, in fact, nuclear winter. The consequence of living in this state is the widespread conviction that there is no future. The pervasiveness of this attitude fostered an absurd culture and the public embrace of an absurdist avant-garde art in the 1960s. Reflecting upon my own experience growing up in a Center for American Weapons Development and Space Exploration, I am American, I will consider the processes that fostered public acceptance of the possibility that there is no future. I will then explore the consequences of nuclear winter for the art world, considering how the public's expectations for art were radically influenced by the presentation of pop art at what I'm calling the nuclear-themed New York World's Fair of 1964 to 65. By the end of the fair, pop art had evolved from one of several competing avant-garde possibilities to the autonomous visual expression of the 1960s. The four pop artists whose work was exhibited there had developed new methods to produce a visual language that reflected this absurd culture.
Hang on, Jenny. We need to make sure that this... Sorry. Otherwise we might not. Might not get it clearly now either. Some surgery will need to be performed. Hopefully there's a doctor. Sorry about that. And can I just point this out? You're speaking quite softly. Yes, you really are. So if you could just speak up a little more. How are you hearing that? Okay, and I can aim that a little bit. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, let's delicately place that somewhere. All right.
Okay. My analysis will also touch on a second of Jeff's insights in which he argues that artists must be accountable to art history. We've touched on this a little bit, not absurd culture, if we are to understand our present reality. To conclude, I will consider how visual art, the art market, museum programming, and arts education evolved to reflect this absurd culture. I will briefly consider the current state of the art world and elaborate Rubinoff's call for a way forward that is possible through art created in accordance with a mature conscience and held accountable to art history. In times of acute stress, artists have the potential, as he has demonstrated in his own body of work, to evolve consciousness and envision a future. "There is no madness like nuclear madness." This sentence marked the opening of an editorial from The New Yorker, not in 1962, but just last month. Of course, most of you will recognize the line from Dr. Strangelove. As commentator Steve Cole suggested, the fact that North Korea's Kim Jong-il had finally made good on his promise to test a prototype missile that might one day reach Alaska, and that his rocket had petered out over the Pacific, was of little consolation. Perhaps the more imminent nuclear threat, or one among many such threats, is posed by the smuggler A.Q. Khan, who administers his own website from Pakistan. Meanwhile, in Iran, Ahmadinejad is running a re-election campaign steeped in nuclear nationalism. The old familiar threat of nuclear winter is still with us. Only now we know for certain that several of the known actors in the nuclear theater are completely willing to abandon the script. Once again, as Dr. Strangelove demonstrated so absurdly, there's no madness like nuclear madness indeed. The nuclear non-proliferation regime has reached its most fragile state of disrepair in perhaps 20 years. Some 24 more nations have entered the pantheon of nuclear weapons powers, and the exact number of A.Q. Khans remains unknown at this time. President Obama recently announced his support for the abolition of nuclear weapons, following the footsteps of Ronald Reagan and Henry Kissinger. Even in a world where minor and major powers alike willfully abandon nuclear weapons, or an ideal world in which this happens, and they agree to redefine strategic policy, as Rubinoff has argued, we are faced with the hard fact that nuclear energy will become a necessity. Unless we make the turn to understand this system and how it is administered, we will continue to inhabit an absurdist culture. The toll of living with this threat became the central concern.
Wait about 10 seconds, we just flip the pages.
I'm not sure where the pages are. I'm sorry. The toll of living with this threat became the central concern of a group of American artists working at the time of the detonation of the atomic bombs that ended World War II. Called the Abstract Expressionists, the leaders of this effort, and these will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure. Sorry, that was a still from Dr. Strangelove I missed. So the leaders of the Abstract Expressionist group working in New York were Jackson Pollock. This is his Autumn Rhythm, 1950. Barnett Newman, his Vera Heroicus Sublimis, 1950 to 51. All of these are large scale. And Mark Rothko, number 313, from 1949. This group deemed naturalism and representation in painting to be aesthetically and morally inadequate to cope with these horrors. They drew from a deep knowledge of art history to push to complete abstraction, as you can see here, asserting that this was their way of rejecting the horrors committed in the name of peace. In the wake of the new realization that man now possessed the ability to destroy all life, these artists sought to forge new spaces of introspection and reflection, all the while maintaining a critical dialogue with art history, drawing on the notable examples of avant-garde artists of the past to address contemporary events. There really aren't very many artists in the past who have addressed events in the recent history or in the present day. Some of those include Francisco Goya. So these are plates 31 and 39 of a series he did looking at the disasters of war, the Napoleonic invasion of Spain. There's the second one. Jericho, The Raft of the Medusa. This is the early 19th century. And Pablo Picasso's Guernica from 1937. The abstract expressionists built on these examples to express a new reality forged by current events, including new and more devastating forms of warfare. Pollock, Newman, and Rothko proclaimed their opposition to scientism and technologism. These are terms they used. They made a decisive break from pre-war modernism, which glorified technology and the machine age. As described by Mara Shapiro, the abstract expressionists advocated for a critical appraisal of technology, not as an enemy to itself, but as an awesome force no better or worse than the system of political economy that used it. Rubinoff has suggested that in times of crisis, artists have a moral imperative to remain accountable to art history in order to expand human consciousness. If artists do not meet this imperative, he has theorized, there's a great risk that the human consciousness will atrophy. With the specter of nuclear winter, there is an acute need for artists to develop new knowledge, particularly to understand the work of the gatekeepers, again, of the military-industrial complex. Artists who remain mired in the absurdist culture are unable to address the true crisis at hand. A couple of notable attempts by contemporary artists to address these concerns while remaining rooted in the culture of absurdity include Damien Hurst, so that's an embalmed shark. The title of the work is The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. This is from 1991. More recently, the couple Jake and Dinos Chapman. The first work, Gigantic Fun, starts with a reproduction of a Goya print from the disasters of war, and you see the cartoon-like drawing over it. A second work of theirs, Detail of Sex, from 2003. Rubinoff suggests that the generation that followed the abstract expressionists, a group of artists who became widely recognizable as pop artists, abandoned their moral imperative. Instead of being accountable to art history, they claimed to represent the absurdity of culture in ironic terms. This theoretical stance forms the foundation of postmodernism, a body of concepts that still dominates the majority of art studio curricula, art historical inquiry, the art market, museum collecting and exhibition policies, and of most concern to Rubinoff, it seems to dictate the agendas of most contemporary practicing artists. If we are to envision a way forward for our practicing artists and arts educators, we must return to the point at which, according to Rubinoff, culture became absurdist. He suggests that mainstream culture was inherently reshaped by the expansion of the North American military-industrial complex in the aftermath of World War II. This is a topic with which I am intimately familiar, having grown up in towns dominated by the defense industry in the U.S. and as the daughter of an aerospace engineer. But this massive machine is notoriously difficult to describe or even locate, due no doubt to the vagaries of systems engineering. If we are to understand the people who have made the turn, we must understand the development of the military-industrial system within the context of systems engineering. On October 1st, 1945, the U.S. War Department announced in a press release that it had accepted custody of 7 defected German rocket scientists for a temporary stay. The brief memo assured that these technical experts would be used for appropriate military projects. Led by Werner von Braun, and you see him in this photo with his arm in a cast, these scientists had developed the V-1 rocket, a liquid fuel cell missile that terrorized London, Paris, and Antwerp in the final months of war in Europe. Traveling at 3,500 miles an hour and smashing through the sound barrier, the missile was capable of hitting targets hundreds of miles away. The team also developed the V-2 ballistic missile and liquid fuel cell rocket engines for aircraft and the supersonic Wasserfall anti-aircraft missile. Just as the war drew to a close, the V-2 ballistic missile offered a preview of a new kind of weapon. And actually, this is just a couple of shots of the V-2 on its firing table and as aftermath, the scene of the aftermath of a bombing in London. So the V-2 offered a preview of a new kind of weapon that would change the nature of war and define post-war politics and culture. Perhaps the most telling fact about it is that more people are thought to have died during its production under slave labor conditions at Nazi concentration camps than were killed by it as a weapon. Amazingly, the team that was responsible for so much bloodshed in Europe and England would start afresh in the United States in a very short time, changing humans' views of the universe and man's potential within it. While it may seem impossible to fathom such an abrupt shift from working under Hitler to promoting the necessity of rearmament in post-war America, the rocket scientists professed that little had changed for them. They said they were still civilians as they had always been, civilians working to develop rockets for the army, regardless of which army, accustomed to carrying out orders regardless of their master. In 1947, the American government, advised by military warriors, along with leading industrialists in several fields, outlined what persists as a permanent policy of readiness for imminent air war. Testifying before President Truman's Air Policy Commission, these men outlined a unified message. Their report, Survival in the Air Age, as it was titled, said that this country, if it is to have even relative security, must be ready for a possible World War III, and insinuating that this war would be concentrated in the air. The Commission recommended that the government develop a massive air armada over 4 years. The major financial magazines, including the Wall Street Journal, praised the plan, and for any who might criticize it, the report offered this: self-preservation comes ahead of the economy. Of course, the career warriors, politicians, and industrialists whose testimony formed the Commission report stood to profit mightily from this new national policy. Its assertion that what's good for the aircraft industry was essential for the survival of America has effectively dictated domestic and foreign policy for 6 decades. In 1948, Truman increased Pentagon aircraft spending by 60%, from 47 to 51, thanks to the Korean War, which has been described as providing a handy harbinger of World War III. The aircraft workforce, which was highly trained and technologically expert, nearly doubled. By 57, it doubled again to nearly 1 million. So there are also about 1.5 million people either in the Army or employed in service support positions for the Army. So that's about 2.5 million people in 57 working for the defense industry in some way. With a population just over 170 million, more than 1 in 200 Americans were involved in the civil aircraft industry, or civil service part of it, which had eclipsed even the auto industry by this point. A major component of this program was the permanent relocation of von Braun and his staff to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama in 1950. I grew up near there, surrounded by images of rockets, and these are great. As I was saying to Jeff, images like this are everywhere in this city. Restaurants, as if in places where you might see the Pope or Queen Elizabeth, and in other communities you see pictures of rockets. So rockets soaring through the blue sky, and always rockets they seem to be pictured in these promotional images, pointing up, either sailing through the sky or pointing up, never pointing down, never hitting their targets. And discarded rocket boosters, this is pretty amazing, dotting the major roads and lit up like this at night. In Huntsville, von Braun developed and refined intercontinental ballistic missiles called ICBMs for the Army. His Redstone rocket was used for the first live nuclear ballistic missile test conducted by the U.S., and the Jupiter C, a modified version of the Redstone, was used to launch the West's first satellite, Explorer 1, in 1958. By the late 50s, these 1 million aircraft workers, mostly college-educated engineers, mathematicians, chemists, physicists, and systems managers, thrived in a new culture that even had its own language, a technicalese that to fluent speakers like my dad probably seems capable of saying everything necessary. Instead of trying something until finding a solution, for example, one exhausts the various possibilities. Instead of figuring it out, one troubleshoots successfully. The various components of this new sector were administered by systems engineers, as I said, a field developed in the 40s by the Bell system to encompass and manipulate increasingly complicated organizations. This new theoretical approach to management relied heavily on statistical analysis to control complex projects that differ greatly from the sum of their parts. The knights of post-war America, by and large, were not career militarists, but rather they sat at metal desks and wore clip-on badges and pocket protectors, working either for the Defense Department or one of an ever-growing number of military contractors, including the Lockheed Corporation, Boeing, and GE. The large majority of the aeronautical workers did not realize that their country was easing into the Cold War and that they'd spend their careers preparing not for a war in the sky, but for an atomic war, in which the enemy remained forever unseen and victory would mean complete annihilation. I estimate that the majority of these workers, like my dad, were titillated as young students by visions of the future in which their rockets would be used for space exploration. That was the original Mercury rocket that was based on the V2, promotional for the Explorer 1. Von Braun propelled this notion through a series of articles in the Huntsville Times, the local paper, and for a national audience in Collier's Weekly. Beginning in 1950, when the article "Dr. Von Braun Says Rocket Flight's Possible to Moon" appeared in the Times, he worked to popularize the idea that space travel was possible in the near future. These essays promoted the necessity of research and engineering, focusing on their application as a means of ensuring American security against the Soviet Union. The first truly palpable sign of World War III's inevitability trespassed into American airspace on October 4th, 1957, thus beginning the space race and the space age. On this date, a 23-inch aluminum sphere weighing just 84 pounds was launched by the Soviet Union. Sputnik quickly set a new template for the Cold War arms race and transformed the aircraft industry into aerospace. Von Braun joined NASA upon its formation in 1958 as a response to Sputnik. In that capacity, von Braun was the architect of the Saturn V Saturn V launch vehicle that propelled the Apollo spacecraft to the moon. It should also be noted that in December of 1958, America's first nuclear power plant came online, initiating also another age, the age of the so-called peaceful atom. Despite the very obvious challenge Sputnik issued to the United States, one that would seem to justify an ever greater concentration of resources in aerospace, then President Eisenhower did not support this approach. The career warrior was adamant that America must wage the Cold War, but he wanted to take a conservative financial approach. He thought nuclear technology was the obvious way forward because it could be very affordable. He proposed that America could ring the Soviet Union with nuclear-armed bombers and convince the world that he was prepared to drop them at the sign of aggression. He envisioned nuclear weaponry as a cheap alternative to maintaining a large conventional military presence around the world. The greatest warrior of them all, as Rubinoff has called him, Eisenhower worked to reduce military spending, meanwhile investing in the foundations of aerospace. By the mid-50s, the US and Soviet Union were pouring millions into refining and allegedly perfecting intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver their H-bombs to the middle of any landmass. Eisenhower despised this buildup, called the ICBM race, because it became so expensive and because it expanded a class of workers for whom he professed disdain. He branded new terms to describe the aerospace workforce. He called it the scientific technological elite, and the parties involved in driving this new economic beast, the military-industrial complex. He was the one who coined the term. He was particularly concerned that public policy might fall captive to the culture of the technocrat. Eisenhower fretted to a group of reporters, "When you see almost every one of your magazines, no matter what they are advertising, has a picture of the Titan missile or the Atlas, there is an almost insidious penetration of our own minds that the only thing this country is engaging in is weaponry and missiles." He warned that this technocratic culture would bring about the end of self-dependence, in his words, self-confidence, courage, and readiness to take a risk. On November 7th of 57, Sputnik 2 was launched into orbit. Eisenhower was deeply troubled by the implications of this 6-ton vehicle carrying a dog and the further concentration of American resources that it prompted. 4 days later, he felt it necessary to remind the nation, "There is much more to science than its function in strengthening our defense. The peaceful contributions of science to healing, to enriching life, to freeing the spirit, these are its most important products." Eisenhower outlined his gravest warning against the development of a permanent military-industrial complex on January 17th of 1960, just days before he left the presidency. Conceding the defeat of his ideal, he attempted to rally and engage citizenry to serve as the only effective defense against the newfound, misplaced power of the defense lobby. An excerpt from his nationally televised address follows, and I'll just read a few lines here. "This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together." I return now to Rubinoff's insight on the end of the age of agriculture. As he suggested, and the old warrior Eisenhower confirmed, the feasibility of escalating war became absurd with the advent of strategic bombing and nuclear weapons. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president with a promise to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth within the decade. In April of '61, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. The United States responded by sending Alan Shepard into space the next month. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis made the possibility of total annihilation a reality. Rubinoff argues that from this point, most Americans have lived in a state of absurdity, accepting the notion that there is no future. A few well-known artists, including Stanley Kubrick and Joseph Heller, adjusted to this new reality, but most did not. Those who did not returned to the ultimate example of ironic absurdity, Marcel Duchamp. There are two works of his on the screen, for a model to subvert the dominant order. As Rubinoff has explained, these artists forfeited the chance that their work would be profound, or would offer people a medium through which to understand the new synthesis that governed their lives. In the early '60s, young artists who opted to dwell in ironic absurdity began to ascend the ranks of the art world. They began producing larger and more pretentious paintings and sculptures that began to sell for high prices. Unlike their predecessors, this group of artists, whose work would be labeled pop art, was wealthy enough that they were never involved in teaching, for the most part, further distancing them from the knowledge base of art history. This group focused on promoting themselves as master artists, and most of them would eventually head up large factory-style studios, co-opting many methods and materials from industrial design production. They abandoned the 100-year-old notion of art for art's sake, and instead went straight for the money. As Thomas Hess later said of this group, it is hard to think of one of their paintings being produced without some plans for its exhibition in advance. And on this point, the major arts institutions were happy to comply. Working hand in hand with dealers, they manipulated values with little regard for inherent artistic value. For many reasons, some of which I will outline below, at the moment when the human species would naturally have turned to its artists to understand the new reality and to evolve group consciousness, these artists seemed to many to be unburdened by this sense of responsibility. The remainder of this presentation will consider how the medium of absurdity, as Rubinoff has called it, that pervaded the culture after 1962, overtook the art world, the art market, and dictated the public's expectations for art and artists. To do this, I will consider pop art within the context of its first ever public showing, the 1964-65 New York World's Fair. There, the innovative products and ideas of the corporate realm, the military, and the visual arts intersected under the universalizing theme, peace through understanding. Exploring the fair sheds light on the government and corporate administrators of American lives and their methods for marketing and selling an absurdist vision of the future. I will consider the implications for pop art within this context, focusing on its complex relationship with technology and summarize its rapid assimilation by the public during the run of the fair. Architect Philip Johnson, who designed the New York State Pavilion and Theaterama, and this is a brochure from the exhibit, photos of the pavilion on the left, and the Theaterama is really a tiny little round structure in the bottom left corner of the photo on the right. He selected work by 10 contemporary artists. He was a curator at MoMA at the time, the Museum of Modern Art, including 4 pop artists. Andy Warhol, and this is his 13 Most Wanted. Unfortunately, this work has not been studied very much, and there are terrible reproductions. That's all that's available. So you can see how it was installed on the outside of the Theaterama. It was actually really controversial because it depicted men on the current Most Wanted list, and most of them happened to be of Italian origin. And the fair director, Robert Moses, was afraid they would offend Italians. So he had Warhol paint it over. He painted it over in silver. And even then, the images showed through, so they had to drape it with black for the whole run of the fair. Maybe only 1 or 2 days that it was showed to the public. Robert Indiana's Eat. So unfortunately, you can barely see Eat. It's a big sign with 5 sort of circular components. and it just looks like a big sign for a restaurant. That's the idea. It's behind the power pole there. Roy Lichtenstein's World's Fair mural, also behind the power pole. I have a better version here. And James Rosenquist, also, this was called World's Fair mural. A leading proponent of the value of a heroic avant-garde art within the public sphere, Johnson allotted each artist a heroically scaled space measuring 20 by 20 feet. I will begin with a brief overview of the fair's organization, themes, and major displays, focusing particularly on the presentation of technology, as I said, and visions of the future. The fair was not granted international recognition because of the provision that no country could be host twice in one decade, and of course Seattle had been the host city in 1962. For this reason, the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries, along with most Western European countries, declined to sponsor exhibits or pavilions as they usually would. Because there was no need to illustrate Cold War ideology, the involvement of the American government in science and technology exhibits was minimal. This resulted in many blatant and revealing self-promotions by corporate military contractors in their own exhibits. At the time, the government was pouring millions of dollars into educational programs aimed at promoting the idea of science for science sake, and obscuring the ultimate objective of the continued expansion of science and technology for strategic projects. At this point, space exploration was widely regarded by the public as noble and heroic. Against the backdrop of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation, the fair's organizers located a convenient means for promoting militaristic and corporate interests in atomic and nuclear power while overlooking the anxieties associated with it. At every turn, visitors were faced with images of space and the atom. This is a real focus at this point. The depictions of this tiniest known particle and the largest known entity look remarkably similar. And that's on everything, dishes and towels and everything. Beginning with a fair icon, the Unisphere. So you can see this large sphere. It was donated, the steel was donated by U.S. Steel. Several views of it at the daytime and at nighttime. The Unisphere had the dimensions of the Earth viewed from 6,000 miles in space. With its and it has 3 satellites, you can see. The majority of technology-themed displays suggested the domestication of outer space by contextualizing it within familiar experience and reinforcing the twin themes, the 2 more themes for the fair, a millennium of progress and man's achievements in an expanding universe. The U.S. Space Park, for example, so here's a good shot of the space park from a fair brochure, co-sponsored by NASA and the Defense Department, allowed visitors to walk among, touch, and pose beside full-scale models of an Apollo capsule, a Telstar satellite, the business end, this is what the brochure said, the business end of a Saturn C5 rocket, moon rocket, and a Titan II booster with its 2-man Gemini capsule, Scott Carpenter's Mercury capsule, as well as replicas of unmanned modules. Many satellites were on display, including weather satellites and research satellites. Thus, as Smith suggests, the normally unapproachable, massively scaled hardware of space and missile technology was tamed by visitor proximity. Additionally, many states that were home to aerospace installations commissioned displays to further domesticate their projects. The Missouri Pavilion, for instance, featured the St. Louis-based McDonnell Corporation's full-size models of the Mercury and Gemini capsules exhibited alongside Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, thus situating space exploration within a more familiar context of aviation history. The huge DM Pavilion, this is an exterior shot, included a prototype, this is amazing, a prototype for a space research station featuring a solar space mirror, a lunar vehicle, and what was promoted as the world's largest cosmic race park chamber, you can see here. Most corporate pavilions built on this theme by anticipating the future in space. The roof of the Kodak building, for example, offered a moonscape for family snapshots in outer space, and the American Interior sponsored Moon Room featured translucent, minimalist furniture perfect for dining in outer space. Representations of nuclear technology, as Michael Smith has suggested, pursued its domestication emphatically. DE sponsored an exhibit called Progress Land, where visitors could witness a fusion demonstration. the Atomic Energy Commission sponsored Adamsville, USA, where young children could activate 24 simulated nuclear reactors behind a barricade marked "Children Only." They were given irradiated dimes as souvenirs. The luxuriously appointed underground house promoted the advantages of underground living. Visitors were invited to dial the desired levels of electric sunshine, twilight, moonlight, and starlight, and to select the geographic and seasonal view outside their underground windows. Promoting the shelter as the ultimate in privacy, the designer praised it for providing protection from all the hazards of modern living, including pollution, pollen, noise, and radioactive fallout. As Smith suggests, the underground house exhibit domesticated bomb-centric design by likening thermonuclear war to an annoyance on the level of noisy neighbors. In this way, the fair dispersed an optimism for the wonders and powers of the peaceful atom, and of course the products brought to you by all these big corporations. Many displays focused on the future and situated the viewer in a fantastical, previously uninhabitable environment made possible through new technology. These visions of the future reaffirmed Rubinoff's suggestion that the absurdist culture holds no prospect for a future. The most detailed vision of the future was presented at Futurama 2, which was an updated version of Futurama designed by Bel Geddes that was at the World's Fair that was held on this site in 1939. So Futurama 2 was a feature ride of the GM Pavilion. It promised to look at the developments that await men in the very near future. The new, it featured new highways cleared and paved by GM's nuclear-powered road builders that would take voyagers to the far reaches of planet Earth and beyond, including the moon, Antarctica, the jungle, and underwater environment, which I believe this is, and the desert, as a succession of what Smith calls techno-colonies. And so a feature of this plan was that nobody would power their own car. There would be some central command center, and people would just get in a car, and the command center would control where they were going. All of these alien environs were depicted as being tamed by GM products. The thermonuclear road builder again, and I think there's a nice photo of a big crane in the image on the right. And there's a huge road builder again. So this is all in miniature, by the way. Let's see. Also, the GM products, refrigerators, automobiles, piloted not by individual drivers, but control centers, as I said. Futurama 2 conveyed powerful messages about the social meanings of technology. While this vision conveniently assigned contemporary corporate powers a critical role in human endeavors, it also sidesteps the problem of the present and the audience's increasing awareness of those problems. The reign of the road builder, for instance, had already been challenged by the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, and in 1964 the Wilderness Act had been passed. As Smith suggested, the future utopian vision of the road builder in the jungle was severely disrupted by President Johnson's Gulf of Tonkin resolution during the fair's second season, 1965. As U.S. involvement in Vietnam escalated, Futurama's vision of a new Eden in the jungle seemed perverse, as Americans witnessed a wholly new and decidedly unidyllic view of the jungle. So images like these, of course, are familiar to everybody, were coming available on television and in the newspapers every day. There's a second image. Futurama and the fair as a whole also ignored the developing feminist movement and was equally blind to issues of race and class. Futurama's vision was untouched by the civil rights acts that were passed during the fair's run, although there were protesters outside the gates. Likewise, the Watts riots and the assassination of Malcolm X, as well as Johnson's war on poverty, were equally ignored. Bruno Latour proposed a theory for understanding the process by which scientific discoveries and designs are enclosed in what he calls a black box that passes the finished product off as inevitable, obscuring other contentions or competing explanations. As Smith has argued, the 1964 fair exhibitors also adopted what was essentially a black box. That was their approach to the display of new technology-based products, resulting in technological determinism. Thus, the human beings behind the machines and the social relations governing the design and production process, the very substance of technological development, were obscured. Thus, the product or design seems to the public to be an inevitable outcome, even though many other contingencies were entirely possible throughout the design process. Smith even suggests that as the processes related to the production of new technologies became more closed in the 20th century, the depiction of these technologies in public forums like the World's Fair also became more closed. The 1939 World's Fair actually did have some displays that depicted factory workers, like automobile factory workers. In '64, there was none of that. Thus, the display of these inventions at the fair and the attempts at normalizing them for the sake of consumption disassociates them from any context, and perhaps most importantly, removes any question of the necessity, effectiveness, or legitimacy of these programs and their dominance over American life. I would also like to consider the implications of Latour's theory for design and production processes leading to the exhibit of pop art displays at the fair. Is it possible that in mimicking the modes of factory production, that these artists also sought to obscure the artistic processes and social context in which their works were produced?
I just wanted to let you know we've got half an hour before lunch. We can stretch it for 45 minutes.
Okay. Instead of rooting their work in the history of art by obscuring the context in which their work was produced, pop artists disengaged from this history. Despite the fact that their visual language appears to be rooted in popular experience, in mimicking the black box method of industrial design and display, pop art presented at the fair stood apart from the established knowledge base of art history, which is paramount to Jeffrey Rubinoff. In refusing to share their knowledge and approach, pop artists resisted the traditional moral imperative for art in times of extreme human difficulty. Instead, they adopted the means of the military-industrial complex. Within the context of the '64 fair, where pop art was first presented to the public, it became embedded in the public consciousness as a component of the corporate futurism that was so carefully cultivated by the sponsors for the presentation of new technology, namely space travel and nuclear power. Rubinoff urges artists to engage actively in oversight, to develop new knowledge in the face of new realities, and to transfer that knowledge to an audience that is prepared to accept such information. For him, this is the definition of the moral imperative for artists, that they approach a body of information at the highest level in order to foster the highest value of interaction. Artists working in the early to mid-'60s could have adopted the objective of getting into the brain of the huge structure of the military industry. The threat of mutually assured destruction, as Smith explained, appended existing narratives of conquest. Because Cold War political leaders could no longer openly pursue total military victory over adversaries, each side was forced to describe its arsenals and strategies as defense and deterrence. In this context, weapons became most useful for their display value in public forums at the 1964 World's Fair, or on the side of the highway in Huntsville, Alabama, maybe. The penultimate contradiction of the nuclear age is that the rhetoric of conquest was revised to describe a strategy of escape. Ultimately, as Rubinoff has argued, this strategy confirms that there is no future. Futurama's techno-colony, as Smith suggested, are actually fallout shelters. As Kristen Fetters has demonstrated, the fair also failed to address the public's growing concern that the increasing automation of human processes by computers posed a serious threat to human intellectual and creative primacy. At past fairs and expos, the fine art that was typically on display coexisted uneasily with latest technologies. The public held fast to the notion that fine art offered proof of the unique creative capacities of humankind, capacities unsuperseded by the machine. The pop artist whose work was exhibited in the New York State Pavilion had embraced the mechanization of artistic production beginning in the previous decade. Warhol's infamous declaration that he wanted to be a machine summarized the shift in the early '60s from the modernist vision of the artist, or the artist's vision of himself, at work in an isolated studio, to a postmodernist critique of authorship that is implied in the factory model. In this era, Rosenquist, whose work is again on the screen, and Lichtenstein pronounced a desire to, in their works, gear themselves like an advertiser or a large company for the production of industrial painting. Echoing their interests, Warhol openly proclaimed that he was pursuing the desires of the public buyer as a consumer. As Jones has demonstrated, pop artists' idea of the studio in the 60s was rooted in the newly revised notions of Marx's technological sublime, the sometimes utopian, sometimes cynical belief in technology as a pragmatic or aesthetic solution to the problems of the day. Aware of the pervasive penetration of the technological into human nature, the young artists of the 60s were compelled to produce iconic imagery that is indexed to technology, to the industrial order or the machine. Thus, according to Jones, these artists attempted to offer a kind of sublimity in both the technological look and the quasi-industrial production of their art. While we can appreciate their prerogative to draw on contemporary reality, we must consider the fact that in the process they developed a rhetoric celebrating technology's sublime power over nature. They did this by aligning their art-making process with models of post-war industrial management and a rapidly developing technocratic culture. The artist's way of knowing the world and the mode of artistic production mirrored the processes and absurdities of the burgeoning military-industrial complex precisely at the time when humanity needed artists to critique it as a means of extending the knowledge base and evolving consciousness. This enacted new relationships between the artwork, the artist, and the public, and prompted an interest in imagery that is instantly recognizable, drawing heavily on advertisements, news clippings — you can see some of this imagery in the Rosenquist — comic books, and the new culture of the superhighway. The problem, as Jones suggested, was that while these artists claimed to be drawing their source material from the real world, they only looked as far as the real world encapsulated in their own work. These artists exemplify what is still true of postmodernists. They were the first postmodernists, that they are, according to Griselda Pollock, textually construed, meaning that they are known only through multiple and conflicted readings of their writings and interviews. Thus, there is no possibility of an absorptive, profound experience with pop art. Initially, fairgoers were either repelled by the pop art on display, or they considered it an extension of the flashy visual program of the fair. On the first day Indiana's Eat was illuminated, for example, a crowd lined up underneath it expecting fast food service. This was a certifiable instance of modern art establishing a connection to modern life. But of course, unless the public acknowledged Eat as art, it can't really be counted. In his failure to include any cues to the public's comprehension of these installations as art, Johnson and the art world, we should say, in effect, abandoned the masses of the fair, who, when left to their own devices, would inevitably choose the simpler commercialized pleasures that were so readily available. When situated within the context of the fair for its public debut, pop art became one consumer choice among many. Max Kozloff confirmed that the fair returned pop source imagery to its origins in consumer culture, removing any reference to established art history or any critique of the mechanization of labor or the myth of the artist as creative master. The exhibited pop art was unpopular with the fair-going public for the most part, which instead seemed to crave the classic art on display in the Spanish pavilion. There were works by Goya and Velázquez, and the Vatican pavilions. So here we see a lineup for the Michelangelo's Pieta, which the Pope actually allowed to be sent to the World's Fair. And images like this circulated throughout the country in various newspapers. This is a cover image for the Post with a sort of eerily green-lit version of Michelangelo's Pieta, the Mother in Christ. Jeffrey Rubinoff would consider these works to be the ultimate example of profound expression by an artist of mature conscience. The media largely overlooked the negative public reception for pop art at the fair. Instead, reviewers, including Peter Benchley for Newsweek, lavished their praise. Peter Benchley, by the way, was the screenwriter for Jaws, encapsulating pop art within the excitement, energy, and sensationalism of the fair. Mason suggests that the media saw itself reflected in this interpretation of pop art. It was this aspect of pop that was readily absorbed into mass culture towards the end of the fair. Calling pop a mass psyche and suggesting that it had captivated the great society, thrived on its prosperity, and exported its restlessness, eventually elevated this quotation from Warhol as exemplary of pop art's aims. This is Warhol again, intellectuals still hate pop, he said. Average people like it, it's easier to understand. Eventually equated pop with comics, including the televised version of Batman that had, by 1966, spawned many countless bat and cape sets, bottles of bubble bath, and bat-to-school themed supplies. Amazingly, by 1966, many major manufacturers had set up divisions of pop art, and this is across the board from clothing to party supplies to children's coloring books and everything. Eventually enthusiastically promoted pop as a tool of escapism from a complex, computerized, nuclearized war. Today, he urged, retaliation is collective, and the button pusher is buried deep in the ground. And severing any preconceived expectation that pop art should or could be profound, that it might contain insights to be valued by future artists, eventually concluded, again, this is in Newsweek, in a society that is so kinetic, so fickle, so impermanent, it is unlikely that any of today's pop values will remain for long. He signed off with this profession by Warhol. I guess it'll all get so simple that everything will be art. By 1966, mainstream culture had rapidly assimilated pop art, anointing it to the defining art movement of the decade. Echoing Rubinoff's assertion that the artist must refer to art history in order to develop profound works for his or her own time, Thomas Hess argued in 1963 that the quality of pop art's connections to other art must be tested. 1963. Great painters, he wrote, are chosen by their ancestors. Their commitments to history have the strength of the inevitable. Pop artists make a trivial contact with the past by picking up a background as if they were a gourmet of ideas. Considering a work from Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster series, of which 13 Wanted Men is a part, David Mose described one example of pop art that referenced art history and still contains no profound insights. In his analysis of Warhol's evolution from painting to silk screening in the early 60s, Mose demonstrated that the artist valued this medium because it afforded new opportunities for extending the Cubist experiments, conflating flatness and depth, and then magnifying this effect. And we see an example here in George Braque's The Portuguese from 1911. The image and the overall effect thus spill into and connect with the space of the viewer. Warhol valued the process as an opportunity to comprehend the methods and meanings of collage and to dissolve himself into painting. So that's the silk screening process, to metaphorically be both the object and the case shadow. Mose suggests that the choice of subject matter related to violent death chimes ideally with his painterly technique. So this is an example from the silk screen, the Death and Disaster series. It's called Optical Car Crash. So Warhol took a photograph from a newspaper of a car crash and duplicated as you see here. Again, Mose suggests that the choice of subject matter related to violent death chimes ideally with his painterly technique, exploiting flatness to paradoxically articulate depth, and that the result is pure presence versus absence, persona versus death. So that's the ultimate result, as Mose suggests. While Warhol does refer to art history, so modernist art history, Cubism, in this example, the outcome is merely a simulation of surface effects. If we accept this reading, it becomes clear that pop art did function to extend consciousness. Another work from that series, excuse me. It becomes clear that pop art did not function to extend consciousness, nor was that Warhol's interest. As Rubinoff has suggested, pop art, the newly reformed art market and museum world, as well as the new educational curricula engendered by postmodernism, deny the artist's imperative to extend consciousness. Pop art in the context of the fair and as it quickly circulated to a mass audience was essentially regressive. Its virtual autonomy in the 60s and the long-lasting resonance of these ideas and methods have led to atrophy. The pop artists failed to evolve new institutions after '62, and their ideas have perhaps never been more deeply entrenched than they are today. As was the case when Hess was writing on pop art in '62, the sole requirement of a work of art is intent. What the artist says goes. There would seem to be great value in Hesse's likening of pop art and its cool attitude towards tradition to the immensely popular salons of the later 19th century. Like pop art, officially sanctioned artists such as Bouguereau and Rosa Bonheur claimed that their work was a function. They did mostly visions of Venus and Cupid and landscapes with horses, kinds of things. They claimed that their work was a function of the demands of a new audience, thus reversing the historical formulation God to artist to public. In the pop factory and the salon studio, as has suggested, the creative energy runs from the audience to the painter. So in both cases, you get a lot of everyday imagery and in-jokes among wealthy people, aristocrats, and wealthy industrialists in New York in the 60s. As Lichtenstein said, in parody, the implication is the perverse, and I feel that in my own work, sorry, I thought I had Lichtenstein there. In parody, the implication is the perverse, and I feel that in my own work, I didn't mean it to be that. Oh, that's okay, sorry. Because I didn't dislike the work that I'm parodying, the things that I have parodied, I actually admire. In light of the dominant interpretations of pop art, that it subverts all that is crass and commercial in society by exposing and subverting it, it is imperative that we consider Hesse's reading. The rhetoric of problematization and subversion dominates artist statements today. For those of us who question whether art really accomplishes these ends, we must be aware of recent history and art history in particular, in this era that, as Rubinoff suggests, is governed by the assumption that there is no future. Donald Cuspit confirms that pop art is not progressive and is in fact reactionary, evading the responsibility that, at first glance, it seems to show. He describes the process through which pop art is created and experienced. Pop art, he wrote, first makes itself apparent as a communication of media cliché images rather than fine art ideas. However, its use of the media cliché image gives that image a spontaneous fine art, or higher art, meaning. The spectator who initially viewed the media cliché as telling a kind of truth about the real world, or at least in some sense corresponding to it, finds the truth hypostasized, raised to seemingly absolute status by pop art's location of it in a fine art context. But on the whole, pop art causes no trouble, stirs no souls to their depths except among the self-styled cognoscenti of the art world, the purists or aesthetes who still want an exclusive culture, not realizing that their culture is as much a social disguise as popular culture, perhaps even more so. Pop art, as Adorno argues, furthers the standardization of consciousness by society, a process that Cuspit described as its attempt to master our inner life for its own purposes. Paralleling Rubinoff's description of our contemporary dilemma, in 1976, Cuspit discussed clichés as instruments of the standardization of consciousness, as well as the form and content of such consciousness. While these clichés do not bind us together, they do bind us together, Cuspit argued that they are controlled thoughts or modes of thought control, stereotyped ways of viewing reality, and as such false to its processes. He wrote that they inhibit our penetration of social and personal reality and repress our recognition of it. They restrict our search for its meaning to prescribed paths and deny us any critical insight into its purposes. Or, as Alan Caprell, an artist, popular artist of this era, said, publicity can, in its own way, create an equally magnificent image of a Buick as the church once created an image of God. In the early 60s, Hess labeled museum officials, collectors, and the media as an overeager audience of communicators on art, which works in unison to produce a phony crisis on the American scene, suggesting that the profound issues, particularly that of life in the aftermath of the bomb, have been resolved. Their vulgar reaction, he warned, would harm younger artists by obscuring the nature of the real crisis which every painter or artist must face in our society if he is to find his identity. Herbert Reed confirmed Rubinoff's insight on art as a biological phenomenon, which Karen Koenig has extended at this forum. Present as a characteristic of the human race, since soon after the species emerged from obscurity, Reed argues that art, the skill required to give meaningful shape to human artifacts, was one of the agencies of that emergence. The immediate purpose of the creative effort, he argued, was the refinement of man's powers of perception and discrimination. Any movement in history that leads to a dulling of the sensibilities, to a relaxation of the consciousness of form, is a retrograde movement, leading to the decline of human civilization. Writing in 1965, Reed expressed great concern that art has always been a vital mode of symbolic discourse. He considered the work of most pop artists to be anti-art, not art, that was devoid of both symbol and discourse. He acknowledged the genuine arts of his day that were engaged in a heroic struggle against mediocrity and mass values, warning that until the processes of standardization, destruction, and disintegration are halted, art remains at risk of losing or dying out. Jeffrey Rubinoff has been engaged in this heroic struggle for more than 3 decades, working here on Hornby Island to forge a sense of a future. For interested artists and art educators, he provides a valuable model for cultivating a broad knowledge base and remaining accountable to art history. Through his work, he provides effective criticism of contemporary history and initiates the evolution of novel institutions that are greatly needed at present. I, for one, would like to express gratitude to Jeff for opening the park to the public and initiating dialogue such as this one, through which he allows others to benefit from his insights. Thank you. Sorry I was wrong.
I'm glad we got through all of that. I think it was really necessary. I noticed you cut a bit of it out. Let's get right into the dialogue because we have 15 minutes only, and we've got Jeff leading us in this one. So if you wanted to just make a few comments on it. It's Brian next. Sorry, yeah. Brian next.
I can.
Yeah.
Wow. Big stuff beneath them. I try to keep it brief, and I just have a few perhaps observations or jumping off points rather than questions. I found it interesting, first of all, that the thrust of the New York's World Fair was essentially propaganda of a future. And the argument that Jeff has put forward is that we've lost a sense of future, that since the Cuban Missile Crisis there is no future. So obviously the propaganda was not believed.
Well, all the visions of the future were in alien areas.
And that propaganda has completely fallen apart. I mean, I remember even as a boy still thinking that spaceships would take us to Mars and space stations. That's no longer imagery in our society.
That's true.
And in the same way, like we don't have that image of the future anymore. And even if you look at, say, Star Wars movies, the other planets look remarkably like ours, actually, when they get there. So that sort of futuristic image doesn't exist anymore. The pop artists were borrowing that imagery, and I think it's arguable either way whether it was effective or ineffective, or whether it was cheap and crass and commercial, or whether it was a commentary. But the intersection of art speaking to society seems to have been lost somewhere in there, and I thought there's a very interesting paragraph you had on page 18 that's just sort of what I want to jump off from. Being a musician, this interests me somewhat too. You wrote, in his failure to include any cues to aid the public's comprehension of these installations as art, Johnson and the art world in effect abandoned the masses of the fair, who, when left to their own devices, would inevitably choose the simply commercialized pleasures that were so readily available. In other words, pop art became one consumer choice among many. It's very interesting to me that it seems to indicate that unless art is explained or interpreted or made apparent, the masses, the sheeple, everybody else who's not an artist, will make an easy consumer choice. It strikes me that that's kind of encapsulates the entire position we find ourselves in today as a society. That we have reduced basically our entire concept of life to what's my consumer choice in all aspects. I work in an industry in which well, the music you're going to hear me play in a little while is 300 years old. Some people in our society made the consumer choice that that's the art that they'd like to consume. And I chose that word on purpose. So, I guess a question would be, if we were to somehow restore or realign or restart, hit the restart button on relevant art, in the visual art world, what is that relevant art going to look like? What's a suitable subject matter, so to speak, if that's even a possible question to answer? I can think of a few parallels potentially in the music world, but that's leading a little too far astray. Do you have anything to say about that?
Not really. I think, and I think Jeff will probably add something about this, but the state that we're at, art education, museum programming, it's all focused on the idea that we have to appeal to people as consumers, to either become artists or to attend a blockbuster museum show.
Well, if I may say, I was at a dinner party not too long ago, and a woman there was doing a doctoral degree, and her main focus was on curatorial subjects. Mm-hmm. And we got into she and I and a friend of mine who's a high school philosophy theory of knowledge teacher, got into a long discussion with her about how he and I, the philosophy teacher and the artist, the musician, were arguing with her about the current way of curating, which is, well, for example, Science World is perfect. I hate taking my children to Science World. I can't stand it. Because there is no curatorial process.
Experience music in Seattle.
What's that?
In Seattle, experience music.
Yeah, there is no curatorial. There is nobody leading you through. And she was arguing that, in fact, that's the whole point. The whole point is that you are free to move from exhibit to exhibit, installation to installation, push whatever button you wish, and there's no narrative. And he and I are arguing that narrative is an imperative to understanding, which I believe would be the argument that keep rooting your art on a historical basis is rooting your art in a narrative. And we've reached a point at which even the people that are studying how to be curators, so to speak, have no concept of the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real sense in academia that we're not critical of the present state of things, right? That's just how it is. That if you want to be a curator of contemporary art, this is what you do.
This is what it is.
Yeah. It's difficult because, yes, modern art has its own language. And where do we start if we want to introduce these concepts to the public? I think Jeff has suggested that only individuals of mature conscience are prepared to receive the insights that are embedded in his work. But yes, where do we start?
But then we lack the guides, because, for example, Johnson failed to include any cues to aid the public's comprehension.
Right. So we sort of you sort of feel like there were a bunch of art snobs kind of laughing at people lining up under the EAT sign.
But maybe it's not the artist's fault.
Yeah.
It is the failure.
Well, actually, this is funny because
cues.
I was actually going to ask you a similar question, and we'll draw that out, I guess, in your dialogue. But yes, I mean, I wonder maybe you can say a little bit at this moment about do you think that your presentations of music has a wide appeal? Is there something in it for everybody? I mean, obviously we're dealing with a multicultural society. No longer do we teach introductions of art that just focus on the development of painting from 1860 to present. You know, I mean, we look at art from all over the world and totally outside the Western tradition. And I just wonder, what do you think about can people who don't have the exposure to the history of music get something out of performance? Yes.
Yeah. Something, but not everything.
But do you think it's worthwhile to expose people to the something?
Absolutely. Absolutely worthwhile to expose people to it. And I mean, it's in so much as it's part of my value system to appreciate Western classical art music. It's in somebody else's value system to appreciate Chinese art music. It's not, or Persian art music, which is very, very different, based on completely different scales and all that. And not to place a value judgment on any of them. But the fact is that I'm a professional musician, highly trained, have been a musician almost my entire life, in terms of training and then professional. And I have nothing more to bring to appreciation of Chinese music than a complete, absolute dilettante observer of it. I have no further insight into that music than anybody would have. So I think that the person with no Western art music background coming to hear me play Bach would be in exactly the same position. I could appreciate the skill involved, and I think that all artists are tempted to eventually diminish their apprehension of what is art, what is quality, down to a level of what's your technique. How good are you at something? Similarly, Jeffrey was talking on his tour about sort of reaching a crisis of his soul, so to speak. Is that how you put it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I had a similar experience when I was about 26. I was at the Banff Center studying. I was doing a residency at the Banff Center. I've done 3 residencies at the Banff Center. The Banff Center, for those who don't know, is a great retreat center for professional artists where you work with mentors. But at that time, I was struggling with a sense that my technique was not good enough. But as the further I tried to develop my technique, the less I had to say in my playing. To the point that I felt like I was saying absolutely nothing at all, yet technically speaking it was still unsatisfying. It wasn't good enough yet. And where did that leave me? It left me sort of just on the edge of a cliff. It was when I released the need to be good that I began to say something again. Having said all of that, it would be completely invalid for me to try to present a concert of Bach cello suites without adequate technique. It would be an insult to the audience and to Bach and to cellists worldwide that have tried to develop a good technique. So for the artist to evaluate another artist's work, the technical foundation is kind of the only common vocabulary that we have cross-cultural.
Well, and then I think in modern art, painting and sculpture, the conceptual is weighed.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's equal or in some proportion to the technique. Yeah.
But the problem is conceptual art, from my completely layperson perspective, you either buy the conceptual or you don't. And if you don't buy it, there is no technique there. There's nothing left for it to stand on. It's become completely sort of faux. And does that go somewhere to answer what you had?
Okay. And then, so Jeff and then Reba, and I'll just keep on peering over there to see.
I'd like to address both sides of this.
Yeah.
Okay. Relevance is the first question, and relevance versus what we're dealing with here. Let's go back to what I was saying about the cave painting. So if we deal with 30,000 years ago, and my proposition that what's happened is, and what happened in those caves was artists passing on the information or the coding of their art to other artists, which they brought along, then the profound in art is the sense of how the ancestors speak to you. And so I look at, when I see those paintings, I feel the ancestors speaking to me. Okay? So when I was lost, my, in a sense, feeling of dying as an artist was when I no longer had any contact with my ancestors. And having been a postmodernist and being part of all of this growing up, it was the disconnection from my ancestors that I felt was the death of that soul. Now, what I understood at that time when I got back to work is that I would find myself really and truly alienated from everyone around me in doing that. It wasn't part of the culture that I had or any of those things. The question of the value of that was not my answer, is that relevant? The question is the profound connection of an artist with his ancestors relevant to the people who are contemporary to him? Not the artist answering to the audience, but the artist answering to his ancestors. If or his, her, I'm sorry, I still am caught with that. Answering to his or her ancestors. And the issue of whether or not there's an audience for it is an unknown. So when I was dealing with the art market itself, it was like they were only dealing with that which was marketable, and the only issue that was out there was, can we sell it? So that was no measure of that. And the true measure of that has come in the last 2 years or the last year really, since I started opening this up to people without having any knowledge at all whether or not, if it were profound to me, whether it would be profound to anyone else. And the response has been really, really very, very gratifying, that people are genuinely interested. But I only sought the audience afterwards. I couldn't deal with the object of the objectives of the audience first, because I felt like as long as I did that from the point of view of a postmodern artist, and so it's not quite the same as yours, because you already deal with the propositions of this being sacred and profound, and so it's brought to you. We deal with a secular, non-sacred world, right? So that which is sacred to the artist, he has no expectations of sacred to anyone else. You know, so in this world, if you're going to dig into that depth, right, and dig down to that. So as you write about, I'm sorry, I'm bouncing, but it's very relevant. It's how we move from this transition to what you're going to do next into your essay. The issue of relevance becomes extraordinarily important to a postmodernist, in that my attachment was finally to my attachment to my ancestors. And so, is it atavistic? No, I don't see that attachment to because the built-in aspect of evolution itself is not atavistic in its nature. So, reattaching to ancestors is not an atavistic journey. Not to me, it wasn't anyway. So, what you're going to do is do the opposite. You're going to reattach to ancestors and not make that an atavistic journey as well. So you're going to handle Bach on this contemporary aspect of it, with the profundity, though, already recognized in that work. And I've grown out of a vacuum where the profundity is lost, certainly to the audience and to the world around it. So when you ask, is it relevant, the answer can only be in whether or not it becomes important to anyone else outside of it. So that can't be done. So what a lot of the discussion around the table has been is, what is the relevance of metaphor itself to the values of society? And we are forced to ask that question by the disconnection of postmodernism from that particular thing. So what we want to do, or the way that this was laid out, is to move from this loss of profundity